My name's Claudine Kasunic. I'm the eldest daughter of Arlene and Stephen Kasunic, who arrived here um, on their honeymoon in, in early November 1943. My dad being recruited to work on the Manhattan Project. I will be speaking about who they were, how they got here, and their time here in the early days of residents of the Hill. As for me, I arrived sometime later, born in the old Army Hospital on DP Road, and I'm a member of the Duck and Cover generation. My father and mother were a little bit older than a lot of the people that were here in 1943. My dad was 30, my mom 26. My dad born 1913, my mother 1917, around the time of World War I. And they went through the Depression in their early teens, late teens, early 20s. And my father was a first generation American. His father immigrated over here from Croatia. And as a young man, 16 or newly married, and he came over and worked on the rail lines in Cleveland, Ohio to earn money to bring his bride over. And my father and his older sister were raised in a Croatian community in Cleveland, being exposed to English the first time when they entered the school system. And my father, he just loved math, analytics, geometry, and mechanical engineering, and wanted to go on for further education. But money was a problem, so he ended up laying railroad line to earn money to go to school. He graduated in 1938 from the University of Detroit with a degree in mechanical and industrial engineering. And later in 1943, he did some studies with electrical engineering. My mother, on the other hand, grew up in Detroit, and youngest of three siblings, and always wanted to study botany, but the money was not available. And so she and her older sister started a hairdressing business and owned and operated a hairdressing salon until her sister developed allergies to the chemicals they used. So they had to give that up. Now, my father worked in various engineering companies and ended up in 1940 working for Hudson Company and doing design engineering, doing design engineering for the clutch, the motor, and the chassis, and some other things with cars. And then in 1941, when the war broke out, a lot of the companies were converted over to the war effort. And he ended up working for a company that had a contract with the Navy to do some, it was specifically to design a machine that would manufacture munitions to certain specifications. And so this is what he was working on in 1941. I think the contract was completed in 42. My mother, on the other hand, after they sold the business and the war started, she did precision assembly work for anti-aircraft machines, because they liked to hire women because they had small fingers and could do the very fine work. And so that's what they were doing. Now, in 1943, my mom and dad had been dating off and on for about 6 years. My dad periodically asking my mom to marry him. And my mom was comfortable where she was. She was living at home and she wasn't very anxious. But in 1943, the people from the Manhattan Project came looking for my father. And it was this machine that he had designed for the Navy. And they came to his place of business and talked to his boss. And his boss said, well, I can give you the manager. And they said, nope, we want the guy that actually designed the machine, the one whose name is on the blueprint. And so they told my dad that they were gathering a group of people that would be working on a project that would hopefully end the war, and told him it was going to be in New Mexico in the National Forest, somewhere in the National Forest. So my dad went back to my mom one more time and asked her to marry him. And she was pretty hesitant. And she said, well, why don't you go out there, check it out and see if you like it, and then you can send for me. It's kind of like what his dad had done. And my dad said, no, no. And so luckily for me and my two sisters, she said yes. So in October 23rd, 1943, my parents were married in Detroit. And they loaded up spare tires in various states of condition in the trunk of the car, put the suitcases in the back, and honeymooned on the way out to New Mexico. Neither one had been west at all. So they're coming down through Colorado, and it's very beautiful, and they get to Albuquerque, and you have to picture Albuquerque at that time. This is 1943. And my dad says, this is the largest city in all of New Mexico. And my mother laughs. And then they get to Santa Fe, and Santa Fe maybe had one stoplight, 1943. My dad says, this is the capital of New Mexico. And my mother laughs again. And one of the saving graces that got my mother to say yes was that she's a nature girl. She grew up with a forest behind her home, and she loved nature. And my dad's selling point was that they would be living in a national forest. So here they are driving out of Santa Fe. It's a 2-lane road. And my mother's looking out the window at all these, what she called squat trees. And she's thinking, national forest. And she's really beginning to question what this is going to be like. So they're driving along, and they come to the turnoff walk. He turns to go up into the mountains, and they're driving along. And this is early November by the time they get there. And it's going up the road. It's muddy, it's raining or snowed. It did that back then. And they're blasting the road because the road was only one wagon width. And so they had to blast the road to make it wide enough. There's no guardrail, of course, and it's muddy, and they're driving up. But my mother was relieved when they hit the top of the road and the trees were tree size. She fell in love with the ponderosa pine and relaxed. Now, when they arrived, they still hadn't built the Sunt apartments where they were going to be staying. And so in some of those, I think one of these, you might see a picture of her standing out in front of a Sunt apartment with a suit on and an orchid. Well, that's their newlywed first apartment. But since the Sunt apartments weren't built yet, they they stayed down at La Fonda until they were built. They put them up there. So they move into the Sunt apartments. And my mother, the youngest of three siblings, had never really learned to cook when she was living at home. And in fact, one of my dad's friends said, does she know how to keep house? And my dad goes, no. Does she know how to cook? My dad goes, no. And he says, why are you marrying her? So my mother is up here in Los Alamos, and her cooking appliances consisted of a 2-burner hot plates. The oven was a metal box with a door on it that you put over one of the hot plates. And this is what she had to learn to cook with. The other thing was, as far as baking in that, we're at high altitude. And she couldn't call her mom. She couldn't call anybody to ask, because this was a closed city. This is, all communication was monitored, if you even could make a phone call. And all mail was redacted, coming and going. So she was pretty much on her own. But so she was learning how to deal with all of this stuff. And the other thing she had to learn how to deal with were food rations, stamps. So you got so much meat per month, depending upon the size of your family. These were stamps. And so as a new bride, she wasn't really handy with that, and she ran out of meat stamps like halfway through the month. And she went to her friend and said, what am I going to do? I don't have any meat for the rest of the month. And her friend said, oh, honey, don't worry. If my husband has potato pancakes, he doesn't care if he has meat. So she gave Mom the recipe, and she fixed the potato pancakes. And she said that she ate a few bites of her potato pancake, and my dad ate his one, and then he started on the other one, and my mother's sitting across from him, and she says, well, how is it? And my dad says, well, if you never fix these again, I'm upset. They're newlyweds. They're newlyweds. Now when they're working up here, there was a big push to get the bomb developed. And my dad ended up working for W1, which is the weapons division. And to work there, he had to take classes from Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, because he had the mechanics. They didn't have the understanding with the radiation. And my mother wanted to work also, and she arranged to get a job with chemistry and metallurgy. But when she told my dad, he asked her, he said, do you know what you are going to be working with? And they hadn't told her. And back then, there was no way of testing for personal radiation exposure and this type of thing. They had no personal dosimeters. So my dad said, well, one of these days we want to have children. And so my mother relinquished and decided not to work. So my dad, like I said, there was a push to get the bomb developed before Hitler did. So my dad would go to work in the morning, come home for lunch, go back to work, come home for dinner, go back to work, and come home, in the wee hours of the morning. So my mother had all this time on her hands, and of course she used it to try and learn how to cook. But she had a lot of time on her hands, so she had, spent some time on her aunt's farm and loved horses. And Dad worked in W1, which was in Los Alamos Canyon. But that's also where the Army kept the stables. So my mother would go down to the stables. You might see some of the pictures. And she fell in love with this one horse called Blue Eyes, which they eventually purchased. My dad purchased a horse, and from there. And before that, they would rent horses. And there was one time that my mother hadn't really ridden a lot, and so they said, "Well, give her, a gentle horse." And so I'm not sure what the Army people were thinking. Maybe this was a joke, but they gave her a gentle horse. And the horse was gentle as long as another horse didn't pass it. And so she's riding her horse down the canyon and with my dad, and some Army personnel come riding up alongside and pass her, and all of a sudden her horse takes off. And this is the winter, and she cannot rein that horse in. He's just going hell-bent for leather. The only way she ended up stopping that horse was running it into a great big snowbank. But this was their recreation. They also had, they did square dancing on the weekends, and they would invite people up from the pueblos to come square dance. And so they enjoyed doing that. And ice skating. Now, ice skating at that time was not on Ashley Pond, but they actually had built an ice skating rink, which is to the west of the current ice skating rink. And you can still see, I actually went down there a couple days ago to see if you could still see the rocks that were built up. My mother took me down there one time, many years ago, to show me where they had built the ice skating rink. And you could see some of the black rocks and some of but you can't pull over and park anywhere to look. So, yeah, so they did ice skating. I know Sawyer Hill was also open for people that wanted to go skiing and that type of thing. But, so this was their life up here. They didn't really bring furniture from home because it was supposed to be temporary. So they had things like, I remember my dad said, or my mom said, that one of the side tables they had was really an orange crate with a covering over it, a wooden orange crate. So but my mother really loved her time up there. And I think that's them. That's by the Rio Grande, and that may be from the trail going down from Bandelier. Bandelier became a very focus place for our family when I was growing up. And when they had the other thing is when they had the explosion at Trinity site. My dad had the opportunity they had asked some of them to go up into the Jemez Mountain. They figured they could see it and watch it, but my dad said it started raining. He just wasn't going to stay, and so they came down. He ended up heading up the group that looked at the gun assembly for Little Boy. And so that was his primary focus. But he was a design engineer and became a chief design engineer, then a chief checker. The opportunity to stay here when it came up or go back home, my parents had fallen in love with this place, and so they stayed. And so, and that's my dad with a slide rule. Are there any questions?
You may just.
Did you grow up here?
Yes, I grew up here.
Okay.
And like I said, my fondest, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
My fondest memory was that on Sundays after we would go to church. Oh, and that's the other thing. Everybody shared the same building to go to church, and it was the theater. And so they would have to go in and take down all the things they had up for the movies because some of them were kind of risque. So they could have church service and then put them back. But one of my fondest memories was we would go down to Bandelier. We'd go to church. My mom would come home, pack a breakfast, and go to Bandelier. And back then, the campfires were right by the stream, and she would fix breakfast. And Dad would lie under the bushes on a blanket, and the kids would go running into the caves and up the ladders and all that type of thing. And no cell phone back then, but my dad had a whistle on him, a 2-finger whistle that you could hear. I don't know how far, but you could hear a long, long ways. So when it was breakfast time, he would whistle, and we would get back to that.
So you went away to school, and then you've ended up back here. You ended up coming here.
Pardon?
Did you go away to school later, college?
Yes.
I mean, and then you came back here.
Well, I graduated high school, and I went to New Mexico State, and I had a friend that wanted to go traveling after we graduated, and ended up going with blue jeans, backpack, hiking boots to Europe. We came back here and waited tables at the golf course. Was a place where they had a bar and dancing and everything at the time, in the 70s. And we waited tables, and people would always ask us, well, you graduated college, what are you doing? We said, we're earning money to go to Europe. And so they'd give us a little extra. And so my friend and I went to Europe and traveled. And while I was over there, I decided I wasn't ready to come home. And so I got a job waiting tables in Norway at a ski resort. And then eventually, came back, worked as a tech at the lab for a while, but I just had a bachelor's degree in biology, and I needed to go back to school. So I'd saved up the money from working at the lab and got my degree in toxicology. And they said, don't come back here because they will treat you like you still have a bachelor degree. So I ended up working for environmental consulting firms, which was always, part of my heart, working in the environment, doing chemical risk assessments. So, and then after working in California for many years, I was ready to leave. There was a lot of people. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, so a couple of headhunters I was talking to, and I felt bad because I decided that I didn't want to stay. And one of the companies said they were opening an office up here. They said, you're from Los Alamos, aren't you? And I said, yes. And my parents were still here, and I always loved it up here. So I came back. So, long story.
So you do live here now.
Excuse me?
You do live here now.
What do I do now?
You live here now.
Do you live here now?
Yes. On North Mesa, no air conditioning. Didn't used to need it, but now I can't believe. Yeah, I grew up in Western area, and that happened to be a place that they had kept the horses. After, there was a meadow up there, and springs. In fact, some of the houses are built over springs in Western area. Yeah, so, but I lived on 42nd Street, and Mom didn't want us. We could have lived further up, Sandia, but she wanted us to be closer to the school, not have to walk so far. So,
That was Mesa.
And the school system back then, the money that was earned in the county stayed in the county. So our teachers, my teachers in junior high had PhDs for history. And this was the way it was. You were raised, basically, you are the sons and daughters of scientists. And there was no prejudice against girls. You were expected to excel just as the boys, which I really didn't fully understand till I went to college and ran into discrimination for the first time, which was, I didn't even recognize it when it happened because I'd never been exposed to it. And yeah, so it was, I think back in the late 60s is when they started spreading the taxes around, so that a lot of my teachers couldn't afford to live up here anymore and had to leave. So, but
So
it
was
was a
that
wondrous
Mesa
place to grow
school?
up.
Did you go to Mesa Elementary?
Made sense?
Mesa Elementary?
Did you go to Mesa Elementary School? What was the name of the school?
Oh, Mesa Elementary, which is now UNM. Yeah. And I wish I could remember. Hamilton, my kindergarten teacher, can't remember. But Mesa Elementary, Pueblo Junior High, and then the high school. So, yeah. But
Did you have Mrs. Nearson? Jean Nearson? Was she one of your teachers?
no, I never had it, but my sister had Jean Nearson. And I graduated high school with John Agnew, Kathy O'Rourke. Kathy was awarded, she was one of the 10 best mathematicians in the whole United States, and went to went to Washington, D.C. to get an award. I mean, this was, yeah. Yeah, so it was great.
What year did you graduate?
What year did you graduate?
67. 67. Yeah. So,
Well, thank you so much for telling us your story.